Welcome all. Many of you will know that Azerbaijan's blockade of Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh has been ongoing for over 50 days now. Media outlets across the world have been covering events, some of them doing a proper job, but others producing content which is kind of problematic. So we're going to be looking at some of the more problematic examples of media coverage of the blockade from around the world. And I'm joined by CivilNet host and analyst Eric Hacopian to do this. Eric, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
So when it comes to the negative coverage of this issue, when you look at it, what is your reaction? What are the types of negative coverage? Are there different issues going on right now?
Yes, absolutely. There's essentially three different varieties. First of all, we need to be clear that I would say 70 to 80% of the coverage actually from around the world has actually been quite accurate in the sense that it outlines, doesn't buy into the nonsensical narrative coming out of the Aliyev regime, and portrays the humanitarian crisis for what it is. So I think we're talking about, the 1 out of 5 cases. But I think if you look at it, it's essentially three sources. One of them is what I call state-driven. And you see it in outlets like BBC, which, is, at the end of the day, is an instrument of British foreign policy. And anybody who doesn't understand that is being naive. So you see some of the biases that are part of, for example, British foreign policy reflected on BBC. In this very morally retrograde two-sidism. I mean, that's one. So this is state-driven.
Okay.
The second one is essentially what I call the bought and paid for variety. And everybody knows if you hire enough PR firms, they can get in editorials here or there written, many of them pre-written by PR firms, or you find someone who put their name to it, who will, for example, go on the attack lines on different things and essentially do the regime's talking points by using Western free media and the forms available to it. So, and I think there's a tendency to underestimate the level of corruption in Western press is actually quite significant, and many people are for sale. Not everyone, but plenty of people are, and I think the regime in Baku has done that masterfully for many, many years. Lastly, I think this is the most complicated one. I think there's a sort of this reverse Orientalism in which there are people who don't have to be paid to have a bias against the Armenian side or the Artsakh side because they cannot. This fight or the stand right now contradicts traditional narratives. You have people who look like they're white. Even though I think whiteness is a very complicated concept when it comes, especially politically. People who are Christians, nominally, and they're normally not the victims. White people who are Christian are not normally the victims around the world. And the victimizers are, Turkish, from that group of family of nations, and Muslims. So this sort of contradicts that. It's also this stereotype of Armenians around the world. If you're a reporter in Belgium or London or wherever, the stereotype of the Armenian is not the Artsakh villager. The stereotype of the Armenian is the rich jeweler. It's Brenner. It's people that are wealthy and well connected. So I think there's this natural inclination that sort of rhymes with people's politics about who the normal victims are or who, and this particular conflict contradicts that very comfortable world narrative that a lot of people have. So it's very hard for them to be dislodged from their preconceived prejudices.
That's interesting, that concept of Orientalism. Like even just one example, CNN's The Lead with Jake Tapper did a great job. I thought actually their report was pretty good. But I saw this in their report and in many other reports, language like ancient feud, ancient rivals, in this idea of it's not solvable, they're always fighting. So that Orientalist idea, I mean, is it also pertain to a stereotype of them being almost savage?
Oh, absolutely. The funny thing is this Orientalist prejudice is also a very strong prejudice against the Azeri people because the underlying theme is, well, you can't really expect them not to act this way. For them to act like the noble savages out of European imagination or Western imagination is to be expected. So I think part of this double standard or a lack of standard And the fact that this case, for example, you compare this siege of Artsakh with the siege of Sarajevo, it's completely different coverage, because you had Muslim Bosnians being, besieged by Orthodox Serbian, militias or troops. So it was a different kind of, that's the norm, what they expect. So I think they just have very low standards of what they expect from the regime in Baku, and to say that they're being inhumane is not something that will make international news.
Right. So I want to talk about BBC Hard Talk's interview with Karabakh State Minister Ruben Vardanyan. There were a few points in it which I'm going to go through, which were seen as problematic. One, the interviewer kind of poses two solutions to the conflict, one of them being the abandonment of Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh by the Armenian population, or accepting some sort of Azerbaijani control. The Lemkin Institute of Genocide Prevention even put out a statement expressing outrage that ethnic cleansing was basically being fronted as an option for conflict settlement. I mean, when you saw this, what did you think?
And it seems to me your only realistic option is either to work out a political deal with Azerbaijan, or for the people, the Armenian community in Nagorno-Karabakh, to decide that this is no longer sustainable and leave the territory. So which is it to be, a political deal or leave?
It's exactly what I just said in the previous statement. It's the double standard. Ethnic cleansing is not acceptable against Kosovars, it's not acceptable against Albanians, it's not acceptable against Ukrainians, but it's acceptable against the Armenians of Artsakh. So I think this is, that's the clear double standard. There's no way that any BBC interviewer interviewing Zelensky or interviewing the Bosnian leaders from the 90s would ever propose that as an option. And it tells you what their biases are, what they think of Armenians in general, and what they think is, well, whatever, ethnic cleansing happened to these people, so what? It's the basic hypocritical Western double standard that whatever fits today's narrative, or their normal reading of who's what and who's the dominant one and who's the weak one and who's being oppressed and who's the oppressor. That's an outrageous question. And the fact that he could ask that really tells you about the level of moral degeneracy that you have in a person that can actually bring themselves to ask that question.
Would you go as far as saying is that's almost bigoted?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Listen, there's free season. There's no price to be paid for racist attitude towards Armenians. And we see it in Aliyev's statements. The things that he has said about Armenians have not been said on the European continent since the 1930s by Hitler.
But he wouldn't even say that about Palestine, I assume, or he wouldn't say that about even some Muslim contexts.
I think we can't get into his head, but the trends and the biases in certain places are very clear.
It's fascinating that you said that. I also want to talk about how a lot of media outlets, especially the Western ones, were focusing a lot on Armenia-Russia relations, on the Russian peacekeepers, and about Ruben Vardanyan's background and ties with Russia in their various reports. I want to give an example from Politico. The title of an article they put out was Russia's New Meddling in the Caucasus. The author is one Maurizio Gheri. He tweeted yesterday, peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan is possible, but a Russia-backed oligarch is trying to stop it. People in Karabakh need to understand there are two sides fighting for peace, neither Russia nor Vardanyan. Another one by the Financial Times. The title is Oligarch Defends Role in Disputed Enclave as Russia Struggles to Retain Influence. The co-author writes, a month-long blockade triggered by Vardanyan's arrival left people in Karabakh without food and medicine. They are all over like Ruben Vardanyan and his ties to Russia. Why is this?
Because they're following up on the talking points on the other side. This is there's two things here. The one thing that's problematic for the regime in Baku is the fact that there's a clear alliance between Baku and Moscow. And this road closure would not have happened without the approval of Moscow. So they have to switch this narrative about how Ruben Vardanyan is the problem. If Ruben Vardanyan is really Moscow's man in Artsakh, this blockade would have never happened. It's just a simple fact. If he is their guy, they will not punish their guy. So it's a simple scenario. So I think their talking points are someone's fed them to them, and you know, it sort of fits the narrative because everything in the West right now, because of the war in Ukraine, is Russia related or obsessed with Russia, and everyone's trying to spin themselves to be on the side that is against the Russian side. But if you look at the facts here, this blockade is a joint Moscow-Baku program. And Ruben Vartanyan does not play a central role in that whatsoever.
Even in the Hard Talk interview, he asks Ruben Vartanyan, are you the Kremlin's man in Karabakh? And says you made your fortune in Moscow and you were described as a corrupt oligarch by the Navalny Anti-Corruption Foundation. My question is this, on the part of Western media outlets, is this lazy journalism, not really looking into the depth of the issue, or is it almost malicious in the sense that you're cheering on a deterioration of Armenian-Russian relations without understanding the humanitarian consequences for Karabakh?
I think it's a combination of not giving two bits about the humanitarian situation because they really don't care, and two, the fact that it just fits into their narrative, and there's a part of it that's lazy journalism. But you know, once journalism is very much like a herd. Once they go in one direction, that's all. That's, you know, all they have is a hammer and everything looks like a nail, and the nail today is Russia.
Right. Yeah, but the fact that they don't care about the humanitarian aspect, they present themselves as humanitarians, as liberal and metropolitan and all that. So, I mean, why
well, that's not true. They don't care because there's valuations in different levels of life, and we're, you know, a couple of steps above people in Yemen and a couple of steps below people in the Balkans or Ukrainians.
Right. I mean, even in the BBC report that was published on January 10th by Rehan Dmitry, the title of the video is Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh say they are under blockade. Yeah. What did you think of that title?
It's outrageous. I mean, just the most basic knowledge of what's going on, that is essentially taking a side. Because it's unimaginable to have, let's go back to 1992, you know, Bosnians say there's a blockade of Sarajevo.
Right.
It's unimaginable. I think we need to come to grips with the fact of the contempt the world has for us as a people. It's very hard for people to understand that, but we need to get a grasp of that. Yeah. And understand where you're at in the scale of things. They don't like us. They don't care about us. And that's just the way it is. You just have to deal with it and put yourself in a position where, you know, you're not living, you don't need to count on the kindness of strangers.
Can we get them to care? I mean, some would argue that the West, state interests and media did not care about Ukraine before 2022, but now they do.
I think it's a question of, part of it's not their fault, part of it is our job of having, with the media, you cannot have them change their opinions. You simply can't do that. Well, what you can do is you can have your story match their primary narrative.
Do you think we're getting our story out?
I think we've actually, in this process over the last 50 days, we've actually done a better job of it than any other time, frankly, over the last 30 years. Partly because the job has been so easy, because it is so blatantly, you know, what's being done is so blatantly evil that it's very hard to spin away, unless you're the BBCs of the world.
Okay, so I mean, we spoke about this obsession with the Russia factor, but another very interesting thing I wanted to talk to you about, which I think is kind of overlooked, was the ecologist or environmental aspect. I mean, these reports, a lot of them presented these so-called eco-activists that are blocking the route, which CivilNet investigators even showed many of them are veterans of the 2020 war. They're military servicemen. They're not eco-activists. Terms like ecocide being used, pollution, mining, destroying the environment. Are environmental concerns trendy for, let's say, like BBC watchers? I mean, what is that all about?
Well, I mean, the whole thing is nonsense. And frankly, there is very media sources. I think it's Microscope that's that's done in exile by Azeri journalists that have done a very good job of dismantling this whole story. However, if you don't know the exact specifics, or this is a secondary thing to you, you hear about environmentalists close roads and You don't understand that in a structurally fascist state, you cannot have environmentalists blocking a road that's controlled by Russian peacekeepers.
Okay.
So if you don't have that level of interest or follow-up, it's one of two things. It's either you just know too little, so you're sort of buying into it, or you're buying into it because you have an incentive to buy into it, and that incentive could be access, money, or half a dozen different things.
And this is an example which is exactly what you're talking about, but I really want to mention this. On the 26th of December, The Guardian, English newspaper, published an article by Isabella Kaminsky titled "Azerbaijan Sues Armenia for Wartime Environmental Damage." She tweets out a few days ago, "This is the first time that any country has sought interstate arbitration under the Berne Convention. If Azerbaijan wins, it will set a precedent for putting an economic value on biodiversity and environmental destruction." 230,000 views last time I checked. She posts, I looked at her stuff, exclusively about the environment, nothing humanitarian. What do you think of the fact that The Guardian, their editors, made the decision to run something like this?
Well, first of all, The Guardian historically has been very critical of the Aliyev regime.
Right.
And they've, to the extent that I think they even banned their reporters from going to Baku.
Mm-hmm.
But in her case, I think she's frankly just a useful idiot.
Right.
You know, I've dealt with journalists all my life, and there's a class of them that are frankly quite stupid and can be manipulated really easily, and I suspect she's one of them.
Okay. Well, Eric, if you had a final message to, let's say, some journalists around the world, young or older, veterans or newbies, who are looking to cover what's happening between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the blockade, how would you say, what would your advice be? How do you approach this issue without being unethical, bigoted, obvious, or giving into Orientalist stereotypes?
Challenge your own ideas, challenge your own prejudices, question yourself on what you're saying and what you're doing. Understand that there's no such thing as unbiased journalism. Everybody brings something to the table. That's a myth. But you need to be self-reflective. Don't fall for stereotypes. And look at yourself critically and with the work that you're doing. Because it has consequences in the lives of ordinary people who don't have your privileges.
Okay. Well, Eric, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.